A Sinister Tale from Maine. Between 1934 and 1961, the Crowhurst Memorial Sanitarium in Charleston, South Carolina, treated over 1,200 tuberculosis patients, yet only 847 discharge records survive in state archives. The missing 353 patient files weren't lost to fire, flood, or administrative oversight. According to internal correspondence discovered in 1987 during renovation of the former sanitarium building, these patients were systematically reclassified under a designation that appears nowhere in medical literature. Extended Care Protocol, Administrative Resolution. State Health Department records contain no trace of these protocols. Medical licensing boards have no documentation of the procedures involved. The Crowhurst family, who operated the sanitarium for 3 generations, maintained that these patients had been transferred to specialized facilities better equipped for their particular needs. When pressed for specifics, family matriarch Dr. Constance Crowhurst would only state that certain cases required intervention beyond conventional tuberculosis treatment. The sanitarium's isolation ward, sealed permanently in 1961, contained medical equipment and pharmaceutical supplies that bore no relationship to any known tuberculosis therapy of the era. The institution's reputation. The Crowhurst Memorial Sanitarium stood as Maine's premier tuberculosis treatment facility from its establishment in 1923 until its unexpected closure in 1961. Founded by Dr. Ezra Crowhurst, a respected pulmonologist who had studied at Johns Hopkins Medical School, the sanitarium represented the pinnacle of modern medical care for tuberculosis patients throughout New England. The sprawling complex, built on 180 acres of pristine forest land overlooking the Penobscot River near Bangor, housed what medical authorities considered the most advanced tuberculosis treatment center north of Boston. Ezra Crowhurst had earned his reputation through pioneering research in pulmonary medicine and infectious disease treatment. His papers, published in the New England Journal of Medicine between 1920 and 1925, introduced revolutionary concepts in tuberculosis therapy that emphasized environmental factors, nutritional intervention, and what he termed comprehensive physiological rehabilitation. Unlike the passive rest cures common in most sanitariums of the era, Crowhurst advocated for active medical intervention combined with experimental treatments designed to accelerate patient recovery and prevent disease recurrence. The sanitarium's reputation attracted patients from across the northeastern United States. Wealthy families, prominent politicians, and even several foreign dignitaries sought treatment at the Crowhurst facility, confident that the family's innovative methods offered the best hope for recovery from tuberculosis. The institution's marketing materials, distributed through exclusive medical channels and private referral networks, promised complete restoration of pulmonary function through advanced therapeutic techniques and boasted of cure rates that exceeded 90%, far superior to conventional sanitarium treatment outcomes. What distinguished the Crowhurst Memorial Sanitarium was its apparent integration of cutting-edge medical research with patient care. The facility housed extensive laboratory facilities, experimental treatment wings, and what Dr. Crowhurst described as physiological optimization chambers. Visiting physicians and medical researchers regularly toured the sanitarium, consistently reporting remarkable innovations in tuberculosis treatment and patient care. Dr. William Harris, Chief of Pulmonary Medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital, wrote in 1935 that the Crowhurst facility represented the future of tuberculosis treatment and praised the extraordinary recovery rates he observed during his inspection. The Crowhurst family maintained absolute control over every aspect of the sanitarium's operations. Following Dr. Ezra's death in 1942, his daughter, Dr. Constance Crowhurst, assumed leadership, expanding the facility's research capabilities and establishing relationships with federal health agencies interested in tuberculosis prevention and treatment. Dr. Constance, who held degrees from Harvard Medical School and the Boston University School of Public Health, developed what she called integrated pathological intervention protocols that went far beyond conventional tuberculosis therapy. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, the sanitarium's reputation continued to grow within medical circles. The American Medical Association regularly cited the Crowhurst method as exemplary treatment for tuberculosis patients, and several medical schools sent students to observe the facility's innovative techniques. The Maine State Board of Health awarded the sanitarium its highest commendation in 1948, recognizing the facility's unprecedented achievements in tuberculosis treatment and patient rehabilitation. Regional newspapers frequently published testimonials from grateful patients who credited the Crowhurst Sanitarium with saving their lives. The sanitarium's medical staff included some of the most respected names in pulmonary medicine and infectious disease treatment. Dr. James Anderson, whose research on antibiotic therapy influenced treatment protocols nationwide, served as the facility's director of clinical research from 1946 to 1958. Dr. Ruth Baker, a pioneering specialist in chest surgery, who had trained under leading thoracic surgeons in Europe, headed the sanitarium's surgical program for over a decade. These distinguished physicians lent credibility to the Crowhurst approach and helped maintain the institution's sterling reputation within the medical community. Patients who recovered at the sanitarium wrote extensive testimonials describing their experiences and expressing gratitude for the Crowhurst family's dedication to advanced medical care. These letters, carefully preserved in the sanitarium's promotional archives, painted a picture of an institution that could accomplish what other facilities could not: complete recovery from even advanced cases of tuberculosis through scientific innovation. Rather than prolonged bed rest and environmental therapy alone, the sanitarium's physical facilities reflected its commitment to cutting-edge medical treatment. The main treatment buildings housed traditional patient wards and diagnostic facilities, but specialized wings contained equipment and treatment areas that most visitors never accessed. These included what sanitarium literature described as intensive physiological rehabilitation chambers, experimental therapeutic laboratories, and advanced intervention units. The isolation ward and sub-level treatment areas, accessible only to senior medical staff with special authorization, contained facilities that Dr. Constance Crowhurst claimed were necessary for complex cases requiring intensive medical intervention. Federal health agencies provided substantial funding for the sanitarium's research programs. Beginning in 1947, the facility received significant grants from the Public Health Service for research into tuberculosis prevention and advanced treatment methodologies. Additional funding came from the Department of Defense for studies on respiratory disease treatment in extreme conditions and physiological optimization techniques. These contracts allowed the Crowhurst family to acquire increasingly sophisticated medical equipment and expand their experimental treatment capabilities. The sanitarium's success stories became legendary within medical circles. Physicians, medical researchers, and public health officials quietly referred their most challenging cases to the Crowhurst facility, confident that the family's innovative methods could achieve recovery where conventional treatment had failed. The Crowhurst name became synonymous with medical excellence, scientific innovation, and therapeutic breakthrough in tuberculosis treatment. Local community leaders universally praised the sanitarium's contribution to Maine's reputation as a center of medical advancement and public health innovation. The mayor of Bangor declared 1953 Crowhurst Sanitarium Appreciation Year in recognition of the facility's 30 years of service to tuberculosis patients. The Maine state legislature passed a resolution commending the sanitarium's outstanding contributions to public health and medical research advancement. Professional medical publications regularly featured articles about the Crowhurst treatment protocols. The American Journal of Respiratory Medicine published a comprehensive study in 1954 documenting the sanitarium's cure rates and therapeutic methodologies. The International Association of Tuberculosis Specialists issued a formal endorsement of the Crowhurst approach, recommending that other facilities adopt similar treatment techniques. These professional acknowledgments solidified the sanitarium's position as the leading authority on tuberculosis treatment and respiratory medicine. By the late 1950s, the Crowhurst Memorial Sanitarium represented everything progressive medicine wanted to achieve: scientific excellence, therapeutic innovation, patient-centered care, and measurable treatment success. The facility's reputation seemed unassailable, its methods beyond criticism, and its results indisputable. Patients, physicians, and public health officials alike viewed the sanitarium as proof that even the most devastating diseases could be conquered through proper application of medical science and adequate research funding. The Crowhurst family's dedication to their medical mission appeared absolute. 3 generations had committed their careers to advancing tuberculosis treatment, and their success seemed to validate every innovation, every experimental protocol, every controversial technique they had developed. As the sanitarium entered its 4th decade of operation, its reputation had never been higher, its methods more widely respected, or its future more secure. Ignored signs. The first concerning report emerged from Dr. Margaret Wells, a pulmonary specialist from Portland who conducted a routine medical inspection at the Crowhurst Memorial Sanitarium in April 1951. Her confidential report, submitted to the Maine State Board of Health, documented several troubling observations that were quickly dismissed by her supervisors as misunderstandings of advanced therapeutic techniques. Dr. Wells noted what she described as non-standard medical equipment in the sanitarium's isolation ward and expressed concerns about experimental procedures that appeared to exceed the scope of tuberculosis treatment. According to Dr. Wells's private correspondence, discovered years later in her personal papers, she had observed patients in what appeared to be modified surgical restraints during procedures that bore no resemblance to recognized tuberculosis therapy. The isolation ward, located in the sanitarium's basement level, contained equipment she described as surgical apparatus of unknown medical purpose and pharmaceutical preparations that were not approved for tuberculosis treatment. When she questioned Dr. Constance Crowhurst about these observations, she was told they represented advanced therapeutic interventions that were proprietary and confidential. The Maine State Board of Health dismissed Dr. Wells' concerns in a formal response dated May 18, 1951. The board's letter, signed by Director of Public Health Dr. Charles Collins, stated that the Crowhurst Sanitarium's methods had been thoroughly evaluated and approved by qualified medical authorities, and that Dr. Wells's observations reflected her unfamiliarity with cutting-edge tuberculosis treatment protocols. The letter emphasized that the sanitarium's exceptional cure rates provided clear evidence that their methods, however unconventional, were producing superior therapeutic outcomes. Families began reporting disturbing changes in patients following treatment at the sanitarium. Eleanor Mitchell, whose husband George had been treated at Crowhurst for 18 months beginning in 1952, wrote to her physician in Boston describing her concerns about George's condition after his discharge. The letter, preserved in medical records, detailed how George had returned home completely altered, not just recovered from tuberculosis, but fundamentally changed in personality, memory, and behavior. Mrs. Mitchell noted that George no longer recognized friends, had lost most of his memories from before his illness, and displayed personality traits that were completely foreign to his previous character. Similar reports came from other families, but these concerns were consistently dismissed by sanitarium officials as natural consequences of recovery from severe illness. Dr. Constance Crowhurst personally responded to worried families, explaining that dramatic personality changes were expected outcomes of intensive medical treatment and that families should be grateful for their loved one's recovery rather than concerned about psychological adjustments. Her letters, written on official sanitarium letterhead, assured families that their relatives had simply overcome the psychological trauma associated with severe tuberculosis infection. The first documented disappearance occurred in September 1953. Harold Price, a 42-year-old lumber worker from Calais who had been receiving treatment at the sanitarium for 11 months, simply vanished from the facility's patient records. When his wife Dorothy inquired about Harold's status, she was informed that he had been transferred to a specialized treatment program designed for patients requiring extended care. Despite repeated requests for information about this program, the Price family never received specific details about Harold's location or medical condition. Sanitarium records from this period, later obtained through legal proceedings, show that Harold Price was reclassified under the mysterious Extended Care Protocol Administrative Resolution designation just days before his wife's inquiry. This classification appeared in the files of dozens of other patients who similarly disappeared from the sanitarium's active patient roster without clear medical justification. When families pressed for details about these extended care programs, they were told that patient confidentiality regulations prevented the sanitarium from disclosing specific information about specialized treatment protocols. The Maine State Police received their first official complaint about the Crowhurst Sanitarium in November 1953. Detective Thomas Lambert was assigned to investigate the Price family's report of their missing relative. His case files, preserved in state police archives, document the obstacles he encountered when attempting to obtain cooperation from sanitarium officials. Dr. Constance Crowhurst provided Detective Lambert with documentation showing that Harold Price had been successfully transferred to an affiliated medical facility, but refused to provide specific details about the facility's location or treatment objectives. Detective Lambert's investigation was limited by the sanitarium's connections to influential medical and political figures. His supervisor, Captain Walter Green, instructed him to restrict his inquiry to standard verification procedures and avoid any actions that might compromise the reputation of a respected medical institution. Lambert's final report, filed in February 1954, concluded that while the sanitarium's record-keeping practices were somewhat irregular, there was no evidence of criminal activity. The pattern of unexplained patient disappearances continued throughout the 1950s. Between 1953 and 1958, at least 49 patients were reclassified under the mysterious Extended Care Protocol designation. Families who inquired about their relatives received form letters explaining that the transfers were necessary for specialized therapeutic interventions that could not be provided at the Maine facility. These letters, signed by various sanitarium officials, assured families that their loved ones were receiving the most advanced medical care available, but provided no means for direct contact or visitation. Dr. Eugene Hoffman, a tuberculosis specialist from Boston University Medical School, raised concerns about the sanitarium's methods during a medical convention in 1955. His presentation, titled Ethical Considerations in Experimental Tuberculosis Treatment, included references to questionable therapeutic practices he had observed at an unnamed Maine facility. While Dr. Hoffman never explicitly identified the Crowhurst Sanitarium, his colleagues understood his references, and several attempted to investigate further. However, their efforts were consistently blocked by sanitarium officials who cited patient confidentiality and proprietary treatment protocols. The Bangor Daily News published a brief article in August 1956 about several local families' concerns regarding relatives who had been treated at the Crowhurst Sanitarium. The article, written by journalist Dorothy Hughes, focused on the Price family's ongoing search for Harold and mentioned similar cases involving at least 8 other families from the Bangor area. The article received little attention, and a planned follow-up investigation was cancelled after the newspaper received pressure from prominent local businesses that had financial connections to the sanitarium. Staff turnover at the sanitarium began increasing significantly in the mid-1950s. Several medical professionals left their positions abruptly, some without providing proper notice or forwarding addresses. Dr. Albert Fisher, who had served as a staff physician for 4 years, resigned in June 1956 with a letter stating that he could no longer participate in medical procedures that conflict with established therapeutic standards. His resignation letter, found in sanitarium files decades later, mentioned serious concerns about patient welfare and treatment methods that exceed acceptable medical practice. The Maine Department of Health conducted a comprehensive inspection of the sanitarium in October 1956. Inspector Dr. Carl Bennett's report noted several irregularities, including incomplete patient records, restricted access to certain treatment areas, and what he described as unusual medical equipment in the sanitarium's isolation ward. However, the report concluded that these issues did not constitute violations of state health regulations, largely because the sanitarium operated under special provisions that allowed for experimental therapeutic research. Local law enforcement continued to receive sporadic reports about the sanitarium throughout the late 1950s. These included complaints from former employees who reported witnessing disturbing medical procedures, and from supply delivery personnel who described unusual sounds coming from the sanitarium's basement treatment areas. However, none of these reports resulted in formal investigations, as the sanitarium's reputation and professional connections continued to shield it from serious scrutiny. The pattern of warning signs continued to accumulate: unexplained patient disappearances, dramatic personality changes in discharged patients, staff resignations, and reports of irregular medical procedures. Yet each concern was individually dismissed, rationalized, or ignored by authorities who remained convinced of the sanitarium's medical legitimacy and therapeutic effectiveness. The institution's impeccable reputation, built over decades of apparent medical success, proved more powerful than mounting evidence that something deeply disturbing was occurring within its treatment facilities. Horror uncovered. The truth about the Crowhurst Memorial Sanitarium began to emerge in March 1959 when Dr. Louise Ellis, a former staff physician, contacted the Portland Press-Herald with detailed allegations about systematic medical abuse and illegal human experimentation. Ellis, who had worked at the sanitarium from 1955 to 1958, provided journalists with copies of internal medical records she had secretly photographed before her resignation. Her revelations would eventually expose one of the most horrifying medical scandals in Maine's history. According to Dr. Ellis's testimony, the sanitarium's isolation ward housed sophisticated experimental facilities that bore no resemblance to any legitimate tuberculosis treatment program. She described modified surgical suites where patients were subjected to unauthorized medical procedures, isolation chambers where tuberculosis patients were confined for months beyond any therapeutic necessity, and laboratories where experimental drugs and chemical compounds were tested on unsuspecting patients. Ellis's detailed account, supported by the photographic evidence she provided, revealed systematic medical torture disguised as advanced therapeutic treatment. The stolen medical records included detailed case files showing that patients classified under the extended care protocol were actually being used as subjects in illegal medical experimentation. These records, written in Dr. Constance Crowhurst's distinctive handwriting, documented procedures involving experimental pharmaceuticals, surgical interventions that were not related to tuberculosis treatment, and psychological conditioning techniques that were never disclosed to patients or their families. The files revealed that many of the transferred patients had died as direct results of these procedures, their deaths covered up through falsified medical records and forged transfer documentation. Dr. Ellis's revelations were initially met with disbelief from medical authorities and law enforcement officials. The allegations seemed too extreme to be credible, particularly given the sanitarium's outstanding reputation and the prominent medical professionals who continued to refer patients there. However, the authenticity of the medical records Ellis provided could not be disputed, and several former staff members began coming forward with corroborating testimony about the sanitarium's hidden experimental programs. Dr. Ruth Baker, the sanitarium's former chief of surgery, provided crucial evidence when she agreed to testify before a state medical board investigation in June 1959. Baker revealed that she had been systematically excluded from the sanitarium's most controversial procedures and had only learned about the extent of the illegal experimentation shortly before her resignation in 1958. Her testimony described a parallel medical operation within the sanitarium, where selected patients were subjected to experimental procedures designed to test the limits of human physiological and psychological endurance. The State Medical Board investigation uncovered extensive evidence of the sanitarium's illegal activities. Subpoenaed medical records revealed that the institution had received substantial funding from federal agencies, specifically for human experimentation projects related to biological warfare research and mind control studies. These contracts, classified at the highest levels of government secrecy, provided the Crowhurst family with virtually unlimited resources to conduct medical research that would have been impossible in any legitimate clinical setting. Atient testimony provided the most damning evidence against the sanitarium. Robert Anderson, who had been a patient at Crowhurst from 1954 to 1956, testified about his experiences in the facility's experimental programs. Anderson's account, delivered in closed session due to the traumatic nature of his testimony, described systematic medical torture, unauthorized surgical procedures, and psychological conditioning techniques designed to completely alter personality and memory. His testimony revealed that many patients who underwent these procedures never recovered their original identities or cognitive functions. The investigation uncovered evidence that the sanitarium had maintained meticulous records of its experimental programs, including detailed documentation of procedures and comprehensive analysis of results. These records, stored in locked files in the sanitarium's basement laboratory, provided irrefutable evidence of the systematic abuse that had occurred over more than a decade. The documents showed that the Crowhurst family had been conducting medical research that violated every principle of medical ethics and patient rights. Further investigation revealed the true scope of the sanitarium's operations. The facility had treated over 1,200 patients between 1934 and 1959, but only 847 had documented discharge records. The missing 353 patients had been subjected to the sanitarium's most extreme experimental procedures, with approximately 70% dying as direct results of these interventions. The remainder had been transferred to other facilities or discharged with completely altered personalities and no memory of their original identities or experiences before treatment. The discovery of the sanitarium's basement laboratories in August 1959 provided physical evidence of the horrific procedures that had been conducted there. Investigators found surgical equipment that had been modified for non-medical purposes, isolation chambers equipped with sensory deprivation apparatus, and laboratories containing experimental drugs and biological agents not approved for human use. The facilities were designed to conduct research that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and medical ethics far beyond any legitimate therapeutic purpose. Testimony from former staff members revealed the elaborate system of secrecy and intimidation that had maintained the sanitarium's operations for over 2 decades. Medical professionals who questioned procedures were immediately terminated and required to sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements backed by threats of professional destruction and legal action. The Crowhurst family had created an environment where dissent was impossible and complicity was enforced through fear and financial incentives. The investigation uncovered evidence that several prominent political figures and medical professionals had been aware of the sanitarium's true nature, but had remained silent due to personal relationships with the Crowhurst family or financial interests in the research being conducted. These individuals had used their influence to shield the sanitarium from scrutiny and ensure that regulatory inspections remained superficial and ineffective. The scope of the cover-up became clear as investigators discovered that multiple state and federal agencies had received reports about suspicious activities at the sanitarium, but had failed to investigate due to the facility's classified government contracts and political connections. The systematic suppression of evidence and intimidation of witnesses had allowed the medical abuse to for over 2 decades while maintaining the sanitarium's public reputation as a premier tuberculosis treatment facility. As the investigation progressed, the true horror of the Crowhurst Memorial Sanitarium's operations became undeniable. The facility had operated as a sophisticated medical research center, conducting illegal human experimentation under the guise of tuberculosis treatment. The systematic abuse, torture, and murder of patients had been disguised as cutting-edge medical care and had continued with the knowledge and support of influential figures in government, medicine, and academia. The revelation shattered public confidence in medical oversight and raised disturbing questions about how such extensive abuse could have occurred without detection for so many years. Legacy and silence. The Crowhurst Memorial Sanitarium ceased operations on December 31, 1961, but the process of closing the institution revealed the extent to which powerful interests were committed to concealing the truth about its activities. Within hours of the closure announcement, federal agents arrived at the facility to oversee the removal of equipment, medical records, and any other evidence of the experimental programs that had been conducted there. By the time state investigators arrived with court orders, most of the incriminating evidence had been destroyed or transferred to undisclosed government facilities. Dr. Constance Crowhurst vanished 5 days before the sanitarium's official closure. Her disappearance was clearly planned in advance, as investigators discovered that she had transferred her assets to offshore accounts and arranged for the destruction of personal papers weeks before her departure. Federal authorities issued arrest warrants on charges of murder, medical malpractice, and conducting illegal human experimentation, but Crowhurst was never apprehended. Intelligence sources later suggested that she had been relocated under government protection to prevent her from disclosing classified information about federal involvement in the sanitarium's research programs. The federal investigation into the sanitarium's operations was abruptly terminated in March 1962 when the Central Intelligence Agency classified all related documents under national security provisions. This classification effectively ended any possibility of public disclosure about the extent of government involvement in the sanitarium's experimental programs. Former investigators later revealed, under strict conditions of anonymity, that they had been ordered to cease their work and surrender all evidence to federal agencies who claimed exclusive jurisdiction over matters involving classified medical research. Families of victims encountered insurmountable obstacles when they attempted to seek justice through the legal system. Wrongful death lawsuits were dismissed on technical grounds, and attorneys representing families reported experiencing professional threats to abandon their cases. Several lawyers who had initially agreed to represent victims received visits from federal agents who warned them that continued involvement in the cases could result in charges related to disclosure of classified information and violations of national security laws. The few survivors of the sanitarium's experimental programs found their attempts to speak publicly about their experiences systematically suppressed. Robert Anderson, who had provided crucial testimony during the initial investigation, was found dead in his Portland apartment in May 1962. The death was ruled a heart attack, but family members noted that Anderson had been in excellent health and had been actively working with journalists to expose the sanitarium's crimes. Other survivors reported being followed, receiving threatening communications, and experiencing other forms of intimidation designed to discourage them from discussing their experiences. Dr. Louise Ellis, the physician whose revelations had triggered the investigation, died in a house fire in September 1962 while preparing additional evidence for federal prosecutors. Fire investigators concluded that the blaze was caused by faulty electrical wiring, but inspection of the building's electrical systems was never completed due to the complete destruction of the structure. Ellis's death effectively ended media interest in the story, as she had been the primary source of documentation about the sanitarium's illegal operations. The Maine state legislature conducted hearings on the Crowhurst sanitarium scandal in 1963, but the proceedings were heavily restricted due to national security classifications on crucial evidence. Witnesses were prohibited from discussing specific details about the experimental programs, and essential documents remained classified despite requests from legislative investigators. The final report, issued in 1964, acknowledged that serious irregularities had occurred at the sanitarium, but concluded that complete disclosure would compromise national security interests and could not be pursued further. Media coverage of the scandal was limited and carefully controlled. Major newspapers published brief reports about the sanitarium's closure and the arrest warrants issued for Dr. Constance Crowhurst, but detailed coverage of the experimental programs was prevented through a combination of legal pressure and voluntary cooperation with federal authorities. Journalists who attempted to investigate the story independently found themselves unable to access key documents or interview surviving witnesses who had either disappeared or been intimidated into silence. The sanitarium's buildings and facilities were demolished in 1965, but the destruction was conducted under strict security and without public oversight. Construction crews working on the demolition were required to sign comprehensive, non-disclosure agreements, and the site was continuously monitored by federal agents throughout the process. Local residents reported seeing trucks removing large quantities of materials from the site during nighttime hours, suggesting that evidence was still being concealed even during the demolition process. Surviving family members of victims continued to search for answers about their missing relatives, but their efforts were consistently frustrated by official obstruction and document classifications. The Price family, whose patriarch Harold had been among the first documented disappearances, spent decades trying to learn what had happened to their father and husband. Their requests for information were denied on grounds of national security, and they were informed that the relevant records would remain classified indefinitely. The medical professionals who had endorsed the sanitarium's methods experienced varying consequences for their involvement. Some, like Dr. Ruth Baker, were quietly reassigned to positions where they could cause no further harm, while others continued their careers without apparent consequence. The lack of professional accountability for those who had enabled the sanitarium's operations sent a clear message that institutional reputation was more important than individual responsibility for criminal medical practice. Government agencies that had funded and overseen the sanitarium's research programs underwent internal reorganization that was presented as reform, but effectively served to obscure their role in the scandal. New oversight procedures were implemented with considerable publicity, but former investigators noted that these reforms did little to prevent similar abuses from occurring at other facilities. The classification of evidence meant that the specific lessons learned from the Crowhurst case could not be applied to improve oversight of other medical research programs. By 1970, the Crowhurst Memorial Sanitarium scandal had been effectively erased from public memory. News reports about the case were removed from newspaper archives, medical papers discussing the incident were withdrawn from publication, and government documents related to the investigation remained permanently classified. The systematic suppression of information about the sanitarium's operations was so thorough that many people who had been directly involved in the case began to question their own recollections about what had occurred. The site where the sanitarium had operated was eventually redeveloped as a corporate office complex, but the construction was plagued by problems that delayed completion for several years. Workers reported discovering unexplained underground chambers and tunnel systems that did not appear on any architectural plans, but these discoveries were not documented in official records. Local residents occasionally reported strange odors and sounds coming from the area, but these complaints were dismissed as environmental phenomena or imagination. Today, no official record acknowledges the true extent of what occurred at the Crowhurst Memorial Sanitarium. The 353 patients who disappeared into the institution's experimental programs have been effectively erased from history, their deaths covered up by a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government and medical institutions. The families who lost loved ones, the survivors who endured systematic medical torture, and the whistleblowers who tried to expose the truth have been silenced through a combination of legal intimidation, professional pressure, and in some cases death. The legacy of the Crowhurst Memorial Sanitarium scandal is not justice or medical reform, but rather a demonstration of how institutional power can be used to conceal even the most horrific crimes. The systematic abuse and murder of patients was covered up not through incompetence or oversight, but through deliberate action by individuals and institutions that valued secrecy and reputation more than human life. The case serves as a reminder that the most respected medical institutions can harbor the darkest secrets, and that the pursuit of truth often faces forces more powerful than any individual investigator or survivor can overcome. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.